Good morning. Good morning. Well, Dave covered everything, so we can really just get down to the scriptures today, which is what we engage each and every Sunday. We dive into the scriptures and teach them from them in our time of teaching. So if you brought a Bible, bring it out. We have some tucked underneath the seats in front of you as well. And when you have one, open up to John chapter 21. John chapter 21 is where we're going to be working from. And today, we've been, as a church, going through the book of John together since the beginning of 2023 now. And we are in the final chapter. We are in the closing chapter of John's gospel, which is a little bit different than all the chapters that have come before it, actually. Dave talked about that. In the first 20 chapters of John, what John is doing, inspired by the Holy Spirit, he's been telling us kind of the who, the what, and the where of Jesus. The who, the what, and the where. Who Jesus is, God. He tells us all this right in his first chapter. He doesn't like slow play, just boom, gives it to you. Who Jesus is, God. What Jesus is up to, fulfilling the great Hebrew messianic fulfillment, hope of the Messiah. What he's up to as the Messiah and where that's going. The cross. So that's what the first 20 chapters of John is all about. And like he said, he doesn't slow play it. And he tells you all that right in the prologue, and then he jumps straight into Jesus' ministry. We'll just give a quick, John organizes Jesus' ministry just around 7 miraculous, powerful signs that Jesus did in and around Jerusalem that tell that same who, that same what. These signs clearly communicate that Jesus is God, and that as God, he's come to earth to be the fulfillment of the Messiah that is prophesied about in the Hebrew scriptures. And so, for instance, these signs kind of work like this. Each one of these signs does this. They're not just there to show that Jesus was a powerful guy, to show that Jesus was a nice guy who healed some people who needed it or fed some people who needed food. John picks the signs. Jesus did those things, don't get me wrong. John picks signs that show who he was as God and what he was doing as the Messiah. So, for instance, if you take like the first sign where Jesus turned water into wine, he does it in a very special way. He does it using what? Does anybody remember? What does Jesus use to turn these things? Purification jars, that's right. He uses Jewish purification jars to put the water into them and then turn it into wine. Now, only God could authoritatively take that which was dedicated to Hebrew devotion, Hebrew religious devotion to God, and turn it into what? Celebration. Only God really could have the authority to do something like that, and only the Messiah could really function as the person who is actually bridging from one age to the next. And so what John is doing in each one of these 7 signs, each one of these signs shows that Jesus is God, and each one of these signs shows that Jesus is Messiah. And that's what John is hoping we take away from the public ministry of Jesus. And where that leads, it becomes very clear early on in John's gospel that that's going to lead to the cross. That is going to go to the cross because Jesus showed up on the scene to authoritatively shake up religion, shake up religious practice within Israel, which means the religious authorities of the day loved him and got on board with him. No. They wanted to hold on to their power. They wanted to hold on to their influence. They wanted to hold on to their privilege that their position was giving them and had brought them. And so instead, they conspired to kill him. So that's the where of John, where Jesus is headed, the cross. So John has done this in the first 20 chapters. After the cross and resurrection, he's accomplished his purposes of showing the what of Jesus, of being God, being Messiah, and God the who, being God and Messiah, the where he's going, the cross. He showed all this, and then at the end of chapter 20, he has a concluding statement. And literally, it's done. The book of John, you could close it. But instead, just like he opens with a special introduction, he gives us an epilogue. So just like a prologue, we get an epilogue. Because really, at the end of John, you're asking some questions, aren't you? Very natural question. So that's who Jesus is. That's what he came to do as the Messiah. That's where he went, the cross and resurrection. But what about his followers? What about the people who are what's next for them? What's next for us? And these are actually the questions that John is answering in chapter 21. He's telling us who the gospel is for, what it does to them, and where it's going to lead them in life too. The who, the what, and the where of the gospel for Jesus's followers. So that's what we're going to do today. We're going to be in the who the gospel is for, what it does to them, and then where it leads them in life. That's all we're going to focus on this morning, okay? And so if you were here last week, Dave took the first half of this chapter 21, and we looked at what happened and how Jesus showed up on the scene after he had been resurrected. He showed up to his disciples once that Sunday night after he resurrected. So Friday night, he's murdered on the cross. Sunday morning, he resurrects. Sunday night, he appears to the 10 disciples. Thomas isn't there. Okay, then a week later on Sunday, he appears to all the disciples again, and then the disciples are told to go north to Galilee, and Jesus will meet him there, which is like an 80-mile hike. Okay, so Jesus is like, I'll see you up there, and they're like, oh, shoot, we got to go on an 80-mile hike to see Jesus? Okay, so they go up there, and then this account is when Jesus shows up to them up in Galilee. And we read the first half of it last week. This is where their disciples are fishing all night. They catch nothing. Jesus says, cast your nets onto the other side of the boat. They catch so many fish they can't bring it in the boat. John realizes that it's Jesus. Peter jumps in the water. Then they all come to shore. Okay, so we're going to pick it up when they all get to shore. All right, so that's going to be in chapter 21, starting in verse 9. Let's read it together. When they got out on land, they saw a charcoal fire there with fish lying on it and bread. Bring some of the fish you just caught, Jesus told them. So Simon Peter climbed up and hauled the net ashore full of large fish. So what this 21st chapter, what we discovered pretty quickly, and it's not just Peter jumping into the water, but it's throughout the rest of this chapter, we're going to see that this is all about Jesus and Peter. This chapter is all about Jesus and Peter. John is going to, by the Holy Spirit, answer the question of who this gospel is for, what it does to them, where it's going to call them in life, where it's going to lead them through this interaction with Peter. And we see it right here. Jesus asks all the disciples to get the fish. Peter goes and gets them. It's really interesting. This is all about Jesus and Peter. So Simon Peter climbed up and hauled the net ashore full of large fish, 153 of them. Even though there were so many, the net was not torn. Come and have breakfast, Jesus told them. I don't know if there's any night nurses in the room here. Do you call it breakfast after you work all night? This is right. I don't know. Yeah, still call it breakfast. Okay, so come and have breakfast. Very strange, but it makes sense, I suppose. So it's correct in the text. Okay. Come and have breakfast, Jesus told them. None of the disciples dared ask him, who are you? Because they knew it was the Lord. Jesus came, took the bread, and gave it to them. He did the same with the fish. This was now the third time Jesus appeared to the disciples after he was raised from the dead. Now, skip down to verse 20 real quick, because I want you to see the context of how this conversation is happening. So this is after breakfast. In verse 20, it says, after this conversation, so Peter turned around and saw the disciple Jesus loved, that's John referring to himself, following them, the one who had leaned back against Jesus at the supper and asked, Lord, who's the one that's going to betray you? And so presumably what's actually happening is this is a conversation that Jesus is having with Peter on a walk. After breakfast, Jesus goes on a walk. We can probably assume that John is with the rest of the disciples. The disciples are following him, and Jesus may call Peter up or somehow is having a one-on-one with Peter on this walk while the others are following behind. Now, John does this. We saw it in the garden. He does this thing where he will refer back to the cosmological garden in different ways throughout his work. So the way that we saw it happen in the garden where Jesus was betrayed was John lets us know at the Last Supper that Satan entered Judas. And then when Judas shows up to betray Jesus in the garden, John is hoping we take away, we preach a sermon on this. John is hoping that we take away Satan's in the garden again, which makes you think, oh, Genesis chapter 3, when Satan came into the garden to tempt Adam and Eve. And so right here, what's happening, perhaps, this is a conjecture. What we have is Peter walking with God in the cool of the day, just like in the garden where it says that God would walk with man in the cool of the day. This is almost a tip-off that redemption that has powerfully worked, where God and man can be together again and walk through gardens in the cool of the day. I just thought that was cool. I wanted to show it to you guys, but that's not. This sermon's not going to hinge on that. So if you're like, that's a little bit much, Ryan, that's a little too much conjecture. Sure. I think it's fun. Okay, let's keep moving. I want you to see the conversation itself, okay? So, when they had eaten breakfast, Jesus asked Simon Peter, "Simon, son of John, do you love me more than these?" "Yes, Lord," he said to him. "You know that I love you." "Feed my lambs," he told him. A second time that's Jesus, asked him, "Simon, son of John, do you love me?" "Yes, Lord," he said to him. "You know that I love you." "Shepherd my sheep," he told him. He asked him a third time, "Simon, son of John, do you love me?" Peter was grieved that he asked him the third time, "Do you love me?" He said, "Lord, you know everything. You know that I love you." "Feed my sheep," Jesus said. "Truly, I tell you, when you were younger, you would tie your belt and walk wherever you wanted. But when you grow old, you will stretch out your hands and someone else will tie you and carry you where you don't want to go." So this is an imagery to crucifixion, actually. This is not a stretching out of hands this way, but this way is what the reference is. And typically people were tied to the Roman cross, not nailed necessarily like Jesus was, although sometimes they were nailed. But John tells us that Jesus said this to indicate by what kind of death Peter would glorify God. So John presumably is actually writing on the back end, much later, very late in the Christian movement in comparison to all the other scriptures. And so Peter has likely already been killed and martyred at this point. So Peter would glorify God. After saying this, Jesus told him, "Follow me. Follow me." It's an amazing portion of scripture, and it's not an afterthought in John's mind. It's not an afterthought in John's mind or in God's mind. The gospel was always set to end here. After unpacking this who, what, and where of Jesus, John really wanted to get to the who, what, and where of his followers. And we know that because of where this narrative strand starts. This narrative strand actually starts at the Last Supper meal, and it actually isn't resolved until right here. And so let's start, and what we're going to see is that this strand really helps us see that this is really about who the gospel is for. Okay, so let's start with that, who the gospel is for, and let's turn back to John chapter 13. I want to show you where this strand starts. John 13, pick it up with me in verse 31. I want to go to verse 31 because similarly, we just saw John talk about what type of death Peter would glorify God with. Glory is attached to death for Peter. Similarly, we see Jesus attach his death to glory starting in verse 31. Okay, so verse 31 goes like this. When he had left, who's that? That's Judas. Judas had left to go talk with the religious authorities to expedite their betrayal plan of Jesus. They were going to wait till after Passover. They were afraid, oh shoot, Jesus has figured it out. We got to do it now or he's going to escape. When Judas had left, Jesus said, "Now the Son of Man is glorified, and God is glorified in him. If God is glorified in him, God will also glorify him in himself and will glorify him at once. Children, I am with you a little while longer. You will look for me, and just as I told the Jews, so now I will tell you where I am going. You cannot come. I give you a new command. Love one another just as I have loved you, but you are also to love one another. By this, everyone will know that you are my disciples if you love one another." We're going to come back to that as well. "Lord," Simon Peter said to him, "where are you going?" And Jesus answered, "Where I am going, you cannot follow me now, but you will follow later." "Lord," Peter asked, Why can't I follow you now? I will lay down my life for you. I'll show you, Jesus. Jesus replied, it's a very ironic reply. Will you lay down your life for me? The irony is that Jesus is like, I came here to lay down my life for you. Will you lay down your life for me, Peter? Truly, I tell you, a rooster will not crow until you have denied me 3 times. And so, of course, over the next few chapters, what we see is Judas betrays Jesus. He tells the religious authorities where to find him, and they bring him to the high priest's house to question him. And that narrative thread is picked up back again 5 chapters later in 18, starting in verse 15. So they've arrested Jesus. They've brought him to the high priest's house to question him. 18 verse 15 goes like this. Simon Peter was following Jesus, as was another disciple. That's John. That disciple was an acquaintance of the high priest. Okay, so we learned John has connections. Okay, so he went with Jesus into the high priest's courtyard. But Peter remained standing outside by the door. So the other disciple, the one known to the high priest, went out and spoke to the girl who was the doorkeeper. Hey, can you let him in? And so they brought Peter in. Then the servant girl, who was the doorkeeper, said to Peter, you aren't one of this man's disciples too, are you? Here's your chance, Peter. I am not, he said. I am not. Now the servants and the officials had made a charcoal fire because it was cold, underlined charcoal fire. They were standing there warming themselves, and Peter was standing with them, warming himself. What we see happens on the inside, John cuts to the inside, is they're questioning Jesus. Say, hey, can you tell us what your teaching is? And Jesus is like, you know my teaching, and if you're worried that my teaching on publicly is different than what I'm teaching privately, go ask the people and they'll let you know that what I'm teaching privately is the same as what I'm saying out loud. You all know my teaching. The only problem is that who are those private people that are going to tell and testify about what Jesus is teaching in private? Those are his disciples. There's one outside saying, I'm not his disciple. So cut down to verse 25. This is what John wants us to take away from it. Now Simon Peter was standing and warming himself, and they said to him, you aren't one of his disciples too, are you? He denied it, and he said, I am not. One of the high priest's servants, a relative of the man whose ear Peter had cut off, who was in the garden, didn't I see you with him in the garden? Aren't you the one who cut off my cousin's ear? You'd remember that face. Peter denied it again, and immediately the rooster crowed. So there you have it. Peter, who was so confident that he could remain bold and strong for Jesus in the face of persecution, in the face of death, denied that he was a follower not once, not twice, 3 times. And from the other gospel accounts, all 4 of the gospel writers record this. From the other gospel accounts, we find that this is a deeply emotional experience for Peter. He actually, in the 3rd time that he denies it, he uses curse words. I don't know that guy. And when the rooster crows, just shame hits him like a train, and he runs away, leaves the courtyard, and he weeps bitterly. Ashamed that he didn't have the courage to say that he was the follower of Jesus. And so now the gospel may have literarily concluded at the end of chapter 20, but this narrative strand has not been wrapped up. And John waited to wrap it up so that we could see exactly who the gospel is for. It's for Peter, and it's for people like Peter. You might say it's for people like you and for people like me, in so much as we are like Peter. What am I talking about? Well, this is what's fascinating about this whole scene in chapter 21 is that it's happened before. It's happened before, and in classic John form, John lets us know that he pieced everything that was going on. He pieced all that together before Peter. John is a classic competitor with Peter. John wants to let you guys know that, hey, I figured this out first. Peter didn't really see it. He's not giving a lot of credit to his friend, but I suppose his friend has passed on and doesn't have to anymore, But Peter's the one that says, it's the Lord. from the boat. And I don't think it's because he has better eyesight. They're a football field away from Jesus. I think John actually said to himself, wait a second, hold on. This scene has happened before. And it did. This is the last long portion of narrative I'm going to read to you guys. But it's back in Luke chapter 5. And it goes like this. This is at the beginning of Jesus' ministry. This is before Peter, John, and James were even Jesus' disciples. It goes like this. As the crowd was pressing in on Jesus to hear God's word, this is chapter 1, Luke 5:1, he was standing by a lake, Gennesaret. He saw two boats at the edge of the lake. The fishermen had left them and were washing their nets. He got into one of the boats, which belonged to Simon, and asked him to put out a little from land. Potentially even the same boat that they were in now. Okay. Then he sat down and was teaching the crowds from the boat. When he had finished speaking, he said to Simon, "Put out into deep water and let down your nets for a catch." "Master," Simon replied, "we've worked hard all night long and caught nothing. But if you say so, I'll let down the nets." When they did this, they caught a great number of fish, and their nets began to tear. So they signaled to their partners in the other boat to come and help them. They came and filled both boats so full that they began to sink. And Simon Peter saw this. He fell at Jesus' knees and said, "Go away from me, because I am a sinful man, Lord." For he and all those who were with him were amazed at the catch of fish they had taken. And so were James and John, Zebedee's sons, who were Simon's partners. "Don't be afraid," Jesus told Simon. "From now on, you will be catching people, or you will be fishers of men," some translations say. Then they brought the boats to land, left everything, and followed him. You see, when Peter encountered the divine 3 years ago, how did Peter label himself? A sinful man. Compared to Jesus, Peter couldn't help but see how short he fell. He couldn't help but conclude that there is no way a relationship between me and this guy could ever work out. This guy is on a different, just moral level than me altogether. There's no way this can work. I am a sinful man, is what he was forced to confess out loud. And to his credit, he wasn't wrong. Over the course of the next 3 years, we see Peter do some, at one point, Jesus has to call him Satan to make him be quiet. Peter really adequately saw himself. He was right. But what Jesus invited him to at the beginning is the same thing that he told him just now. Follow me. Yes, you're sinful. Yes, you mess up. But that doesn't disqualify you from following me. Yes, you've done some bad things, perhaps even terrible things. But that doesn't mean you can't follow me. You see, if you can say along with Peter, "I'm a sinful person. God and me, we're clearly on different playing fields altogether. There's no way that we could really be in relationship together. I don't see how relating with him could ever work out." If you feel that, if you can recognize that, the gospel is for you. That's who the gospel is for. If you have this sense that you have fallen short and there's no hope for God and you, and the idea of God and you being together terrifies you, there's not something wrong with you, there's something incredibly right with you. The gospel is for you. The Holy Spirit has begun to open your eyes and given you an invaluable gift, which is an awareness of who God is and an awareness of who you are. Namely, his perfection and our imperfection. This is what Jesus told his disciples was the role of the Holy Spirit, to convict the world of our sin and God's righteousness. To open our eyes to the fact that we are incompatible with God, that relationship with him is going to be impossible absent something happening to bridge some gap. That we must be kept apart from him. Peter realized it 3 years ago. But people who see those things, who have a grasp and awareness of this, that's exactly who the gospel is for. That's who the gospel, it's counterintuitive, but that's exactly who it's for. That's who God calls out to. That's whose boat God will borrow. That's who God is going to drop a miracle into their life. That's who the gospel is for. And so conversely, the gospel is not for the person who concludes, it's not that bad. I'm not that bad. I haven't done anything that terrible. Why do you want me to focus on my worst moments? After all, I've done a lot of good things too compared to most people, so I'm pretty good. The gospel isn't for that person. If that person doesn't feel a need for it, doesn't want it, the gospel of Jesus Christ, it's not for good people. It's for those in need of goodness. That's who the gospel of Jesus Christ is for. There's nothing you can do to get the gospel except admit that without God, you're still enslaved in some sense to that sin, to that darkness, that there's no hope, that you're in that dark state of affairs. And this is why Jesus has shown up again to Peter. It's pretty clear now that Jesus didn't show up on the shore to eat some fish with his disciples, right? No, he's entered this scene to engage Peter's denials. And how do we know this? This charcoal fire is how we know this. This charcoal fire. Charcoal fire is used a whopping 2 times in the entire New Testament. And it's both times here in John, when Peter's denying Christ and when Peter has 3 affirmations of Christ as well. Before you could say that charcoal fire is, it's just happenstance that Peter walked up and he was there and there's a charcoal fire there. John is bringing attention to it just because he's John and he likes details. But we can't say that so much about this fire. Jesus made this fire. Jesus chose this fire. And he chose this charcoal to intentionally point back to Peter's shortcomings and his denials. But what I find most beautiful about this, and what I love about just Jesus generally, is how incredibly gentle it is. Like, this is so gentle, the way that Jesus points back to Peter's denials, that Peter actually missed it. Peter doesn't even see what's going on. He misses it. If you go to the 3rd time he asks him, it says in verse 17, Peter was grieved. He's saddened, like, Jesus, why are you asking me this again? He's emotionally distraught, but he doesn't see what's going on. He probably didn't understand until John later that afternoon was like, Peter, it's a charcoal fire, man. You denied him 3 times. He just gave you the opportunity to profess your love for him 3 times. Can't you see what's going on? He missed it. That's how gentle Christ is. He didn't even see it. It went over his head. It's amazing. It's really amazing. Jesus, God, is more concerned with orienting his followers towards what's next than dragging them over the coals of what they've been through. That's true. That's true no matter what. That's what Jesus is up to here. At the end, after Peter answers him every time, yes, Lord, you know that I love you. Jesus gives him something. Feed my lambs. Shepherd my sheep. Feed my sheep. You denied me, but now you will profess who I am over and over and over, and you will do it to the point of death one day. Jesus isn't here to convict Peter. He's here to commission Peter. He's here to give Peter what's next in his life. Maybe you're like me. I was like this for so long, and I still get into this where I can really become hyper-focused and obsessed with my shortcomings in life. Anybody else? Like I can dwell on those. I can look at those. I can see the failure. I can let that turn into shame. I can think about what could have been if I hadn't fallen short. It's miserable. One day, God gave me, I think it was from the Lord, God gave me this phrase that I say to myself every now and then. Maybe some of you have heard it, as I think I've said it to some people when I see this happening. I say it to myself every now and then. But I was in one of those moments, and God came to me. I said, be nice to my friend Ryan. Hey, be nice to my friend Ryan. And maybe you guys have heard it. This is what I say to myself now when I get into those moments where I'm just dwelling on the shortcoming. Be nice to my friend Ryan. Am I going to be harsher than Christ? Oof. Take it easy on my friend Ryan. So is Jesus bringing up Peter's shortcomings? Absolutely. But why is he doing it? It's to commission him. Because ultimately, at the end of the day, Jesus is pleased with Peter. That despite his shortcoming, Peter has shown up. Sunday, the first Sunday, the second Sunday, just took an 80-mile hike up north to go see Jesus again. Peter continues to show up. Jesus is incredibly pleased with Peter. He loves him so much. He has a huge plan for his life. And if Peter is wallowing in guilt and shame about his denials, he'd miss it. He'd miss it. So who's this gospel for? It's for broken, sinful people. It's to call them somewhere else. It's for all who have found an awareness of God's holiness and their own sin in their life, and encourages them to keep moving. That's who the gospel's for. That's who it's for. Now, what does it do? Let's look at the interplay between Peter and Jesus, because it's really here that we see what the gospel does when it enters into somebody's life. When they had eaten breakfast, Jesus asked Simon Peter, Simon, son of John, do you love me more than these? That's first is probably referring to the disciples that are following them, or even more broadly, Peter was really fearing just the opinion of other people, which is why his denial came. Do you look at my evaluation? Do you love my evaluation of you more than the world's? You could even phrase it. Do you love me more than these? Yes, Lord, he said to him. You know that I love you. Feed my lambs, he told him. A second time he asked him, Simon, son of John, do you love me? Yes, Lord, he said to him. You know that I love you. Shepherd my sheep, he told him. He asked him the third time, Simon, son of John, do you love me? And Peter's grieved that he asked him the third time, do you love me? And he said, Lord, you know everything. You know that I love you. Feed my sheep, Jesus said. Now, first off, John is doing a unique thing with the word love in these verses that perhaps you've heard of. In the Greek, there are actually 4 words for love. One of them being agape, which is that form of love which represents like a selfless and unconditional love. And then another form is phileo, which represents more of like a brotherly, a familial, a relational type of love. And Jesus is looking at Peter, and in his questioning, he says, do you agape me? Do you agape me? Do you phileo me? And Peter responds back, yes, I phileo you, I phileo you, I phileo you, all 3 times. Perhaps you've heard sermons about this and with some fruit, and there's nothing wrong with those, but I'm going to take a different route away from that this morning. I'm going to footnote the president of the seminary that Dave and I went to, because Mark Young, brilliant guy, Christian educator for 40 years. I saw him give a sermon on this passage, actually, when I was back in seminary. Sheesh, it was a long time ago, 15 years ago now, Dave? Whew. Anyways, and he was given a sermon on this in chapel. And when he came to it about this usage of love, he said, John just really like to use synonyms, and it's not all that clear why sometimes. And I was curious by that. And I looked over at my Greek professor, and she did one of these. Yes. So I think it's good footing that we don't necessarily have to get stuck in that, although I'm not going to say there's nothing there at all. So I'm just going to go another direction with it. Instead, for a second, I want you to imagine that you're in the place of Peter, walking in the cool of the day with Jesus, the God of the universe, and he looks over to you and he asks, do you love me? Now, how would you answer that question? You give your answer, he looks at you again, and he says, do you love me? Whew. Probably the first thought in my mind would be like, what's the first answer? Wrong. So you give your answer, then he looks at you again. Do you love me? Huh. How would you respond? I think we can appreciate the difficulty of answering this question that Peter's in right now. The God of the universe shows up to you, I want to walk with you, and asks you, do you love me 3 times? You haven't caught that he's just trying to give you 3 chances to say yes. How would you answer it? What would you appeal to? Perhaps you might say, yes, Jesus, I love you. I read my Bible. I pray almost every day. Yes, Jesus, I love you. I do my best to obey your command. Yes, Lord, I love you. I give a lot of my time. I give a lot of my money to the church. What would you, how would you answer that question? There's a variety of ways that you can answer that. Peter could have said those too. Yes, Lord, I love you. I've hung out with you for 3 years. Could have said that. Yes, Lord, I love you. I do my best to listen to all that you've told us to do. Yes, Lord, I love you. I left everything to follow you. Everything. But he didn't. He didn't say any of that. And I want you to entertain this possibility with me. The possibility that Peter, this disciple of Jesus who always seemed to speak up, say the wrong things at the wrong times, what if Peter gives the perfect answer? What if this answer truly reveals what the gospel does to a follower of Jesus? Because when the gospel shows up to someone who feels the weight of their sin, who feels their brokenness in comparison to the perfection of God, when they experience that profound mercy from God, who looks at them and gently says, I forgive you. Not because of anything that you've done, but because I love you. Not because of anything you've done, only what I've done through Jesus Christ. I forgive you. Even after that happens and someone encounters that, they can often still think that they need to do things to make it right in life. That their actions, their continued actions or obedience towards God are going to be that which continues to ensure God's mercy towards them. Okay? A gospel that came and said there's nothing you can do to make yourself right with me gets hijacked by human religion. This is human religion broadly all over the globe, and says you have to be good to stay in God's good graces. And they conclude, okay, God, I'll listen to you. I'll work really hard on our relationship. I'll make a ton of sacrifices to you so that you know that I love you and we can be okay. But not Peter. Sure, he's done some silly things, but he's been in the school of Christ for 3 years now. 3 years, and the gospel has done something to him. The gospel has revealed to him there's nothing that he can do to remain on God's good side. That's not how the gospel originally entered his life. That's not how it started, and so that must not be how it's going to be maintained. 3 years ago, it came without him doing anything on the shore of that lake. So it's definitely not how it's supposed to be now. So when Jesus asks him if he loves him, he doesn't point at what he's done for Jesus up to this point. Instead, he answers, yes, Lord, you know. You know I love you. So what has he done? He's chosen to not ground his love for Christ in his feelings, in his actions, you could say in his hopes, and instead he's chosen to ground his love for Christ in the knowledge of Christ. Lord, you know that I love you. Lord, you know that I love you. Lord, you know everything. You know that I love you. Because when we do look at this passage in the Greek, the verb know is in the perfect tense, and it's the only word that's in the perfect tense in this passage, which means it's meant to jump out at you. The knowing of Christ is actually the focal point of this passage, not necessarily the love of Peter. Okay? That's what actually jumps off the page at you. It's this special Greek verb that the gospel writers use a ton, and they're usually using it when Jesus has a special knowledge about someone that isn't very apparent on the surface. So like when these friends get together and they lower their paralyzed friend down on a mat in front of Jesus, it says that Jesus seeing or perceiving or knowing their faith saw this. Okay, or when the uh, religious leaders would think things about Jesus that were really negative. After he'd say like something really life-giving, and they'd think things really negative, Jesus would say, but Jesus, seeing, knowing, perceiving their hearts, would look at them and say, why do you think such evil things in your hearts? Okay, so this is a special knowing verb that's used of Jesus all the time in the Gospels about something that isn't necessarily apparent on the surface, like for Peter, who had just denied Christ 3 times, but he can see it happening in that person's heart anyways. Peter's seen it for 3 years. He's saying, Jesus, you know my heart. You can see it. You know that I love you. You know there's no case I can make for loving you. As many good things I might point to, there's equally bad things. You know that I love you. And what Peter is doing is he's actually essentially letting Jesus correct him if he's wrong. You know I love you may even carry with it the notion, but you let me know if that's not the case. You let me know if I don't love you. He's grounding the knowledge of his love in the knowledge of Christ. That's what he's doing. This is what the gospel does to somebody. The gospel brings with it a faith that whispers to you that God loves you and that God chose you through no work of your own, and that your love for him is a product of his choosing work of you, not your choosing work of him. Jesus put it like this in chapter 10. And we have to go there because this chapter 21 is all about shepherding, right? And in chapter 10, Jesus says this in verse 14. He says, I am the good shepherd. I know my own, and my own know me. Just as the Father knows me, and I know the Father, I lay down my life for the sheep. How do you know if you love Jesus then? Because Jesus loved, chose, and knows you. It's a bit counterintuitive. That's it. That's how the gospel of grace works. That's what this gospel of grace does to a follower of Jesus. It produces a love in them for their Savior based on what he's done. It's not necessarily all the time evidenced by what they do. And if we're mistaken about that we love him, we put it in Jesus' court to correct us. Because ultimately, the gospel, when it comes into the life of the sinner, it tells us that it's not about us. It's not about who we were. It's not about what we did. It's not about who we are. It's not about what we're doing. It's not about who we will be or what we might do one day. No, it's about Jesus. It's about who he is, what he did, what he will do to wrap all of this up one day and eradicate evil. It doesn't mean that we don't have meaning, that we don't have purpose, but it means that we cannot live in our meaning and in our purpose until we surrender at the foot of the cross. And it's there that God purchased our life with his and attached our story to his story. So don't hear me say your story is not valuable. It's incredibly valuable. Why do you think Jesus is pointing back to these 3 denials? Because that's going to shape how his redemption works through Peter moving forward. It's incredibly important and crucial. It's going to shape where he's going to bring Peter. And that's where we're going to go next. We've talked about the who of the gospel, who it's for, the people who has God by his love and grace granted awareness of who he is and who they are, what it does. It reorients a relationship with God towards what he has done and away from what we have done. Now where the gospel leads. After Peter answers, Jesus gives him something to do. Feed my lambs, shepherd my sheep. Feed my sheep. Those 3 things. That's what he tells him to do. And if you didn't know any better, you might think that Jesus is a rancher. Just let it hit. But Jesus didn't have any sheep. He didn't have any sheep. He didn't possess any literal sheep, so we need to consider it metaphorically, just like he called himself the Good Shepherd. He invoked this metaphor to help us grasp our relationship with him, okay? It might seem demeaning at first to be called a sheep. If anybody's been to like a stock show and seen the sheep there, the ones that aren't like, we're trying to compare who has the prettiest sheep, but if you just seen the run-of-the-mill sheep, I'm from Denver, so there's the great Denver stock show every year. The sheep are nasty. They're really gross, so it doesn't feel like a great, oh, thanks, Jesus, for that. That's a little demeaning. Perhaps it is a little, but it gets at this reality that even though Jesus is a human like us, we're very different beings. Like, he's God, and we're not. And so this metaphor of a shepherd to sheep is one he leaned on quite frequently to help us capture this dynamic that, yes, like, I'm a friend of sinners, and I'm 100% human, just like you're 100% human, but I'm also 100% God. So I'm the shepherd and you're the sheep, okay? So it's a category difference, okay? So this is why he used this metaphor. And it's clear that with Jesus's sheep, this is a flock that he envisioned growing a ton. In the Gospel of John, it even talks about there are sheep who are not of this pen, and we need to go get them too. But then it also becomes clear in John that Jesus is getting out of here. He's leaving. And so it's like, whoa, hold on a sec. The shepherd's leaving the sheep. What's going to happen here? And so what becomes clear is that Jesus is going to delegate his shepherding to various, you call them under shepherds, who themselves are sheep. This is Peter. This is John. This is the other disciples. This is the hundreds of thousands, perhaps millions of people that God has called to lead his people over the last 2,000 years. And I'll let you know this. As a sheep, it's a completely terrifying duty, because Jesus at least had the category difference. But as just a sheep, it's a completely terrifying duty to come alongside sheep and shepherd them and to feed them. But in another sense, it's completely fulfilling, completely satisfying as you look in the rearview mirror, because you can see and feel the grace and the knowledge and the humility that you needed in order to do it come from God. It's a really incredible thrill of a ride. It's terrifying and incredibly rewarding at the same time. But Jesus has asked certain people to feed and shepherd his flock throughout the centuries. But what exactly does that mean? What does that look like? What can you as a sheep expect from your shepherds, your human shepherds, who are themselves sheep of Christ too, looking to the good and one and only good shepherd? I wanted to go into that really quickly, just what you can expect of your shepherds, because I don't know if it's always that clear. But I do want to just go through it quickly, because I want to pivot to where this is calling everybody, where the gospel calls everybody in life, not just the under shepherds, but from here we can gather some good things on what you can expect from your shepherds, those who would call you, who you follow in the local church. So the first thing is obviously feeding. That's what Jesus says, right? Feeding. Under shepherds who are sheep themselves. I keep wanting to say this. I'm not trying to put authority over anybody here. Okay, like, we are sheep ourselves, me and Dave, and we are still sheep ourselves. We feed the rest of the sheep. What do we feed them? Well, we're in the Gospel of John, so we have some pretty big clues. What do under shepherds feed the sheep? How about the bread of life? How about living water? Jesus gives under shepherds the responsibility of making himself, these are phrases Jesus used to talk about himself consumable to his flock. That's the responsibility of an under shepherd, of talking about him and teaching about him in a way that you can digest, in a way that you understand who God is, what he came to do, what his plans are for humanity in your life moving forward. It's our job to present Jesus Christ to you in a clear, understandable manner that you can consume. And the place we start from to do just that is the entire counsel of the scriptures. All of them speak to who Jesus is. Now, if we were to tell you that God is utterly mysterious and unknowable, we would be failing you and Christ. If we were to talk about God or Jesus in terms that you can't understand, we would be failing you and Christ. So this is part of what feeding the sheep is to present Christ in such a way that people can understand it, consume it, and have relationship with him. That's our job, to help you understand Jesus as the bread of life and the living water so you can consume him. The second is shepherding. There's two components to this. First, under-shepherds guide the flock towards pastures. That is, places they can be fed and spiritually grow. And so it's our job to create a culture and space where you can encounter the graces of God. To create a culture and spaces where you can encounter the grace of God. That's what we do. We protect a culture and spaces where spiritual life can be found. Things like the Sunday morning worship service, things like our cohorts and our cadres of the various other ministries that we do as a church. We are charged with keeping the flock and creating spaces and helping you enter them where you can encounter the grace of God and his goodness. That's part of what we're tasked with as under-shepherds of God. Now, secondly, that's first. Secondly, under-shepherds are really charged with keeping the flock safe. It wasn't uncommon for sheep to wander off and fall off cliffs in agrarian society, and even still today. And it's our job as under-shepherds to keep the flock safe, which means to identify false teaching about God and Jesus that is enticing to people like us, and to identify that. And if we see people wandering off and falling, kind of help guide them back and have conversations about that with them so that to keep them safe. That's part of what we do. And so that can happen with like Christian celebrities and Christians' books, but it can also happen as people could come into our community, this very room here, and for their own personal gain will want to isolate you from the family here for their own personal gain and try to lead you astray in that way as well. It's our job, it's the shepherd's job to protect from that. And so you can always ask us to do those things for you. If you hear like a wind of teaching that is gaining popularity or intriguing to you, but you're not sure, is this safe or not? These are conversations we love to have because these are the conversations God has called us to have. It's not a weird conversation for us. It's actually really fun. It's super fun for us. And that's how you know that it's because God's called us to it, because we're passionate about it. We have a good time with it. And sure, there's a lot of weight in that conversation. But at the end of the day, God has given us the Spirit in order to help us have a great conversation about that and keep people safe. Okay, so that's the second thing. Third is knowing. Knowing. And this is the third thing that we think you can expect of your under-shepherds. That you feel God has called you to be fed by, that you feel God has called you to be shepherded by. And it's probably implicit in the first two, feeding and shepherding, but we want to make it explicit because we want you to know that you can expect to know and be known by the people that lead the church. And because this is actually, what was that next statement after Jesus said, I am the good shepherd? I know my own and my own know me. The shepherd is among and knows their sheep. And so this knowing is also, it's almost a prerequisite of the first two. Like, how can I know if I'm actually talking about Jesus in a way that you'll understand unless I know you guys? How can I know where the dangers are in culture and in the life of this community unless we know each other and we have a relationship that can kind of tip off those things to us? That's why, like, sometimes, I feel like sometimes I've been obnoxious to some of you guys. Maybe I need to apologize for being too intense about this. But some of you I've texted, been like, hey, let's get coffee. And you're like, oh, shoot, Pastor wants to get coffee with me. And you show up to that meeting stressed, and I can tell. And I'm like, oh, no, I'm just trying to get to know you. That's it, And I can tell you, like, and it just melts off of you. Like, I'm sorry, But really, like, we really just want to know you and be among you. And so if you do get that text, it's not something weird. Like 99 times out of 100, it's not something weird. And if it is intense, we'll give you a heads up. Hey, this is going to be intense. Okay, so like if you get a text from us, no, we just want to know you. Okay, it's part of what we feel like God has called us to as shepherds, and it's something we take really seriously as we serve Jesus. Okay, so those are the three things: feeding, shepherding, knowing. That's where the gospel takes, it took Peter, took the disciples, took the leaders of God's people. Well, where does the gospel lead everybody else? Where does it lead everybody else? Because it takes all of us somewhere. It takes all of us somewhere, and that's this. The gospel leads all of us, similar to Peter, to pick up responsibility for the family of God. That's it. That's what it is. It's loving your Christian brother and sister well. It's you saw Dave up here. Text to Kevin. If you see someone that's following, take up the responsibility. Try to keep them connected to life and reach out to them. It's leading a cohort. It's serving on Sundays. It's being involved in someone's life in a real way where you're taking responsibility for them. If anybody's gone through our family membership class, that's all the class is trying to do. We're not trying to get our member count really high so we can feel good about ourselves or report back to some denomination for funding or something like that. We try to communicate a culture of this is a place where we love one another. We take responsibility for one another. That's where the gospel leads. That's why we do it. There's thousands of ways this actually manifests in our midst, so don't get too single-tracked about it. There's thousands of ways. Because all the way back in John chapter 13, remember that's what it said. 13 verse 34, Jesus said, I give you a new command. Love one another just as I have loved you. You are also to love one another. By this, everyone will know that you are my disciples if you love one another. This is where the gospel leads you. This is what your faith in Jesus ultimately puts you on the hook for. This is what the fine print of following Jesus really is. Dave kind of hinted at that last week. Chapter 21 makes it really clear kind of what Jesus' followers are on the hook for, and it's an intense love for one another. That's what it is. Not in order to gain God's love, you already have that, but to let his love work through you towards one another, to love like family. And just like family, you didn't pick one another, but you're stuck with one another. That's how it is, just like family. But God's love, it works. And if you push through the setbacks that always present themselves as you try to have a relationship of significance with anybody, okay? It happens in the most romantic of relationships, setbacks. Let me tell you what, setbacks. But if you push through those setbacks, soon you'll see the love of God is pouring through you to them and through them to you, and it's the most beautiful thing that can be seen and experienced this side of heaven. In fact, what we like to say is when that's happening really well, what we see is glimpses of heaven coming to earth. A deep community of love and sacrifice for one another, of sharing and giving and receiving and loving. One that Jesus says, this is how people are going to know that you are following me, because glimpses of heaven are in your midst. So I could tell you story after story of that taking place, but we don't have time. Okay. So who's the gospel for? People who are aware of their broken, sinful state. What does the gospel do? It empowers us to leave human works-based religion. Leave that behind that says, I'm good with God if I do good things. Instead, we learn that we're good with God because he chose us. And that's why. Where does it lead? Into radical love for one another, to see and bless your brothers and sisters as full creatures that God created them to be. Will you pray with me?